I'm your host, Michael Messerly, and this is Scary, but True. Our first story is called Girl in the Box. This story includes themes of kidnapping, sexual assault, and abuse. Listener discretion is advised. On May 19, 1977, 20-year-old Colleen Stan was hitchhiking from her home in Eugene, Oregon, to a friend's home in Westwood, California. Colleen was a very experienced hitchhiker. She was always careful and felt that she had good judgment when it came to accepting rides from people. Earlier in the day, she was even offered 2 rides that she declined due to them putting her off for one reason or another. Along Interstate 5 in Red Bluff, California, Cameron Hooker pulled over to the side of the highway, offering Colleen a ride. Colleen looked into the car and saw Cameron's wife, Janice, and their newborn baby sitting inside. This gave Colleen a sense of safety and gladly accepted the ride with Cameron and his family. Stopped at a gas station quite a ways down the highway, Colleen was in the restroom. While she had some alone time in the gas station, she suddenly got a horrible, sinking feeling in her gut. That's when a voice in Colleen's head told her to run and jump out the window and never look back. She calmed her fears, pushed that voice to the side, and returned to the car. Approximately 20 minutes after being on the road again, Cameron pulled off the highway saying that he wanted to investigate some nearby caves. They pull up to this wooded area with a nearby lake, and Janice takes her and Cameron's baby down to the lake to play. As Janice and the baby are out of sight, Cameron crawls into the back seat with Colleen, puts a knife to her throat, and threatens her life. Cameron ties Janice up and puts a homemade box over her head. This wooden head box was designed to prevent light, sound, and fresh air from entering. At that moment, Colleen's freedom was stolen from her. Before the kidnapping, Cameron and his wife Janice reached an agreement that Cameron could capture a slave to take Janice's place. Up until that time, Cameron has been using Janice to act out his bondage fantasies, and now Colleen was his new slave. The horrors began the first night she was taken. Colleen was beaten and then suspended by her wrists and blindfolded while Cameron and Janice had sex below her. She was then locked away for 23 hours of the day in a wooden box that resembled a coffin and put under the couple's bed. In January 1978, Cameron forced her to sign a contract that would give herself to Cameron as his slave for the rest of her life. Cameron would also tell Colleen that she was being watched by a large and very powerful organization called the Company, which, if she tried to escape, would harm her family and torture her. Colleen subsequently became Cameron's slave, referred to as K, was forced to call Cameron master, and was not allowed to talk without permission. Colleen would continue to be kept in a wooden box under her kidnapper's bed. In 1978, Janice even gave birth to her second child in that bed right above Colleen. Colleen's greatest fear, which Cameron reinforced daily, was the Company, the supposed large and powerful organization that will punish Colleen should she try to escape. So Colleen complied with Cameron's commandments, which led to her getting some freedoms. Colleen was allowed to jog, work in the yard, care for the family's children, and even help Cameron build bigger accommodations, including an underground dungeon for even more slaves. Colleen had an open door, access to neighbors, and a telephone, and still made no attempt to escape due to her fear of the Company. In 1981, Colleen was even allowed to visit her family, but did not reveal anything about her situation due to her fear of the possible consequences. Because of her homemade clothes, lack of money, and years of absence of communication, Colleen's family had believed that she was part of a cult. They did not want to try to pressure her too much, as they feared that she would stay away forever if they did. Cameron had feared that he'd given Colleen too much freedom. He took Colleen home and again locked her in the wooden box under his bed, where she would spend 23 hours a day every day for the next 3 years of her life. She would use a bedpan and would eat scraps of food every day. Cameron's children were told that Colleen had gone home, but once the children went to bed, Colleen would be taken out of the box to be fed and tortured. 3 years later, and a total of 7 years after being Cameron's slave, Colleen had finally gotten some freedom back, and this time used that freedom to get away from Cameron Hooker and his sick torture game. Janice, Cameron's wife, decided to tell Colleen that the company is not going to go after her for trying to escape. Janice has also claimed that she had been abused and tortured by Cameron over the years. Colleen called Cameron from a bus station to tell him that she was leaving him and then caught a bus home. Colleen did not contact the police in the months that followed, but continued to contact Cameron because Janice wanted to give Cameron a chance to reform. 3 months later, Janice reported her husband Cameron to the police. Janice informed the Red Bluff police that Cameron had kidnapped, tortured, and murdered 19-year-old Marie Elizabeth Spanicki, who disappeared on January 31st, 1976 from Chico, California. According to Janice, Marie was walking home when she was picked up by her and Cameron. Marie was taken to Cameron and Janice's house, where she was hung from her wrists and assaulted. She was shot in the stomach with a pellet gun and then strangled by Cameron. The couple wrapped Marie's body in blankets and buried her in Lassen Volcanic National Park. Authorities could not locate any remains, so due to lack of proof, no charges were made for this murder. Colleen would recall her time as prisoner at Cameron Hooker's house, and she remembered seeing a picture of Marie Elizabeth Spanicki propped up next to the box she would be held in under the bed. Cameron went to trial in 1985, facing charges for sexual assault, kidnapping, and using a knife in the process. Janice testified against her husband in exchange for full immunity. Cameron Hooker was found guilty and sentenced to consecutive prison sentences, totaling 104 years. On April 16, 2015, Cameron Hooker's parole request was denied and will be eligible for another hearing in 2030. Something I witnessed as a child that I've never been able to explain. I've gone back and forth for years about sharing this. I'm keeping everything anonymous and vague because I don't want this tied back to me or my family. This happened when I was very young, but old enough to remember it clearly. My family is Christian and believes in God. And while I didn't understand much at the time, now that I'm older, I view this as something spiritual and demonic. We lived in a house where the living room and kitchen were one open space. We had an old family desktop computer set up in the living room near the TV. One night, while both of my parents were home and my siblings and I were all in the same area, my oldest sister was on the computer watching one of those pop-up scare videos that were popular back then. She called me over to watch it. I got startled, laughed it off, and went back to playing. She then called another one of my sisters over without warning her. I wasn't watching them directly, but suddenly I hear my sister scream at the top of her lungs. When I turn around, she was visibly shaking. My mom immediately ran to her, grabbed her, and my dad started yelling, asking what she had been shown. Everything escalated so quickly. My sister was shaking uncontrollably and then suddenly went limp. Her arms dropped to her sides. I remember my mom looking terrified in a way I'd never seen before. My mom called our pastor late at night and said we needed to go see him immediately. While my dad got the car ready, my mom sent me into a bedroom with my sister. I sat next to her on the bed and held her hand, trying to comfort her the only way I knew how. I remember quietly telling her, "It's okay. Everything's gonna be okay." What haunts me is how cold she felt. Not just cold hands, but cold in a way that didn't feel alive. Years later, after attending funerals, I realized it felt exactly like touching someone who had passed away. While I was holding her hand, out of nowhere her head whipped around and her eyes locked with mine. Her eyes were completely black. I remember feeling an overwhelming sense that whatever I was looking at was not my sister. Now that I'm older, looking back, I know that she was possessed. We drove to the church and went inside. A teenager tried to help and gently touch my sister's hands, but the moment she looked at him, he backed away and went to get the pastor. We were brought into the main area of the church. My parents told me everything was fine, but I knew it wasn't. I sat behind my dad while the pastor and others prayed over my sister. They were rebuking whatever was inside of her in the name of God. When my sister began screaming, it didn't sound like her voice at all. It was deep, distorted, and unrecognizable. She kept screaming, "It hurts! It hurts!" Later, she told me that she wasn't actually in pain, but whatever was inside of her was, and that is what was screaming. My dad picked me up and tried to block my view, telling me not to look, but I looked anyway. I saw my sister twitching and crawling, moving in ways that didn't look human or natural. I hugged my dad tightly, frozen with fear. After that night, no one talked about it again. Years later, when I was older, I finally asked my sister what had happened. She told me that she watched the video, she felt something jump into her body, and everything went black. She felt like she was watching herself from outside of her body, and that she could see both herself and whatever was inside of her. She also told me that when she turned her head and looked at me that night, she was scared whatever had possessed her was going to go after me next. When the prayers ended, she was suddenly back in her body, exhausted, terrified, and afraid that it was going to happen again. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I just know what I saw, what I felt, and how clearly this memory has stayed with me. As a Christian, I believe this was something spiritual and demonic, and it's something I'll never be able to forget. Sometimes it's not pretend. I grew up in the backwoods of Washington State. My family lived on a 5-acre plot of land. More than half of the property was covered by dense woods that expanded past our property lines for miles. My entire childhood was spent in those woods with my brother, playing, climbing trees, and catching frogs at the ponds. It was everything two boys could ask for. My twin and I were about 8 years old, and one late summer night, I heard someone screaming outside far off in the woods. I had my window open, so I was the only one to hear it. It shook me to my core. I've heard quote-unquote screams before, but they were from coyotes. This was different. I went to my brother's room and opened the window to see if he could hear it too. Sure enough, he did. Not wanting to bother our parents, we decided not to say anything. After about a week of hearing these screams, we did decide to tell our parents. They told us it was probably coyotes and it was nothing to be afraid of. Every day, the screams were getting closer to the house. Then our outdoor toys started going missing. I wasn't able to find my skateboard I left outside one night, my brother's bike was taken, and our favorite pool inflatables were gone. Again, we told our parents about the screams and now our missing toys. Of course, they said that the screams were coyotes and that our stuff went missing because we don't take care of them and they probably got lost. The screams kept getting so loud and close that I stopped sleeping with my window open. But one night, I heard yelling that was closer than it ever was. I peered out the window and what I saw made my blood run cold. Just outside my second-floor bedroom window that looked over the backyard into the edge of the woods, I saw the figure of a slender person. Even from my window, I could see the moon reflecting off the whites of its eyes, large and bulging out of the sockets, the eyes fixed on the house unmoving. It was a man who stood a foot taller than the tall wooden fence that separated the backyard from the trees. His gaze slowly shifted towards my window, and he caught sight of me. Slowly, with his long, slender legs, he made his way across the fence to the gate. He's coming my way. He's getting closer, and I can't move. He was close enough for me to see his face clearly. His mouth wide open, an expression of surprise on his face. His head decorated with tufts of hair. Most of his scalp was bare, as if he was pulling his hair out. His clothes were tattered and dirty, and he wasn't wearing any shoes. He stepped right under my window and stared up at me, his eyes unmoving, unblinking, his mouth open like in a perpetual scream, but he was silent. I'm not sure how long we stared at each other, but felt like minutes. Frozen in fear until a blood-curdling scream came from his face that was still unmoving and unblinking. The scream broke the hold of my body. I jumped back from the window and ran straight into my brother's room. He heard the scream as well, so we busted into our parents' room, screaming and crying. They assumed I had a bad nightmare and scared my brother. No matter how much I pleaded, they would not believe me. The last week of summer was the worst of them all. The man with the big bulging eyes would stare at me from the tree line every night. Every once in a while I would see him during the day, but every time I yelled for someone to come over, he would disappear. I was relieved when school started up. I started seeing the man less and less. I thought maybe it was my imagination that conjured up this image. My parents might have been right. As a kid, I had quite the imagination. However, on a late Tuesday night, there was a knock on the front door. The thought of the screaming man came into my mind. My father answered the door and greeted a cop. The cop explained that the neighbors dialed 911 for someone breaking into their pool house. The officer told my father that the man had been living in the woods for a few months, and that if anything went missing over the summer, then it might be found at the camp the intruder had set up. I went out the back door to catch a glimpse of the man that broke into the neighbor's property. I put my face up near the car window to peer into the cop car. A face slowly inched closer to the other side of the glass, eyes bright white and bulging, mouth ajar, and tufts of hair became visible. It was the screaming man from the summer. I guess after telling my story, the message I'm trying to say is that kids aren't always playing pretend when they say there's a monster. I sure wasn't. Our final story is called A Woman Wakes Up from a 2-Week Coma and Wants to Go Back. I am a physician out of Western Massachusetts. Unfortunately for me, I started as an officially licensed doctor fall of 2019, meaning that the pandemic is where I had to get my sea legs for being a hospitalist, so to speak. Being a new physician during the pandemic was harrowing for a lot of reasons, but this experience was by and away the most disturbing I've had since I started practicing. As a bit of a preamble, I've never completely understood why people have such an intense fear of oblivion. If you were being kidnapped, tortured, and eventually killed by Albert Fish, would you truly be interested in an afterlife where you retain that memory? Death is often very merciful because it's true erasure. You no longer have to live with terrible pain or haunting experiences. Trauma lives on only for those who can remember it. As for hell, I think that we're able to create something much worse than fire and brimstone, even with the best intentions. That's where this story comes in. During the height of the pandemic, a lot of non-ICU staff were being asked to help run the ICU because the volume of critically ill patients was so unbearable. Normally, I only work with hospitalized patients on the regular wards floor, but in December of 2021, I was drafted to be a pseudo-ICU doc, much to my own dismay. The vast majority of our ICU patients were intubated. For those of you who are unfamiliar, this means that they had a breathing tube in because their lung tissue was completely non-functional. Despite what you might see on TV, most patients who are intubated are given sedating medications. They essentially sleep through the experience. This is both humane and therapeutic. We generally don't want people who are intubated to be trying to breathe on their own. It can essentially overinflate their lungs. The day this happened, it was like any other normal shift. The patient in question was a 60-year-old woman with no medical history. She had been intubated for 2 weeks because her immune system had essentially shredded her lungs trying to eliminate her COVID infection. Pretty much the same story as everyone else, and like many others, she was slowly recovering. Her blood pressure, however, had really been a difficult thing to control. It had been dangerously low intermittently throughout her entire admission. Because of this, the sedating medication we used primarily was ketamine, which generally does not have an effect on your blood pressure, but it can be associated with dissociative reactions, which is a type of psychosis. When you have been on the ventilator for that long, your trachea actually starts to become rigid and inflexible. If that change happens, you can't really breathe without a ventilatory tube. Your body has essentially molded around this foreign instrument. Because of this, 2 weeks or so is when we decide whether or not you need to have a tracheotomy performed. Think those smokers with a hole in their neck. This often has a very negative impact on a patient's life, so in an effort to see if she could breathe on her own, we began lowering her sedation. 30 minutes later, I heard it. Initially, I couldn't recognize the sound. It was like if you recorded the sound of a blender and then listened to it on cheap headphones. The sound was high in pitch, but at the same time it was a bit muffled and coarse. When I turned around, I saw this patient sitting up straight in bed. I gasped and moved back slightly. That sound I heard was her screaming into her ventilator tube. Not yelling, not hollering. She was screaming bloody murder through her ventilator tube. Her eyes were bloodshot and bulging. It looked like she was crying. Blood was also starting to leak down the corners of her mouth. Oral and laryngeal trauma from her screaming so vigorously. Since she had COVID, there was no one in the room with her when she initially started screaming. This was part of infection control. In order for us in healthcare to not contract COVID, we needed to essentially be in hazmat suits to interact with a COVID patient. We all rushed to get the proper equipment on to enter her room. In that time, she managed to completely pull out her ventilator tube. I'll never forget the things she said when we got to bedside. She was pleading with us. "Please, send me back. Please, this is all wrong. This is not who I am anymore. I don't want to be here. It hurts and it is wrong. I don't want them to notice I left. I want to go back. Please, please send me back." She was saying this through the blood that was now leaking down her throat and through her mouth from the trauma of removing the tube. We did eventually get the tube back in after we gave her some emergency sedation, but the damage was already done. She died a few hours later. One family member was able to visit her at bedside while she passed. We did not have the heart to explain in full graphic detail what had happened. We only said that she took her breathing tube out and it had caused a lot of damage. I don't know where our consciousness lies when we are sedated for that long, but I am afraid of that place. Death is permanent, but it's also balanced and equal. Everyone rests in oblivion, unbound from the traumas of life. The hells that we can create, however, those places do not seem nearly as merciful. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a like, review, or a comment. As always, the original stories are linked down in the description below, and I claim no credit for the stories themselves. Be sure to follow the show everywhere at Scary But True Pod. And if you have your own scary story that you'd like me to share, email it to me at scarybutTruePod@gmail.com. My name is Michael Messerly, and I'll see you next time with more scary but true.